In the green space, the finale of our series, End of War. Listeners, you can watch today's program as well as hear it. See the live streaming video on our webpage at WNYC.org. Click on Brian Lehrer Show. Congressman Dennis Kucinich is still here. John Horgan, author of The End of War, is still here. Also with us now, two professional peacemakers, I think we might call them. They work to prevent war for a living. Manal Omar, director of Iraq, Iran, and North Africa programs for the U.S. Institute of Peace in their Center for Post-Conflict Peace and Stability Operations. That organization was created by Congress. She was previously Middle East Program Director for Oxfam and worked with Women for Women International in Sudan and elsewhere, and she joins us via phone from Washington. And here in the green space, Lena Slachmuijlder, Chief Programming Officer of the private not-for-profit group Search for Common Ground. Born in New York, she has lived and worked in Africa for 21 years as a human rights defender, journalist, performer, and more. Lena, Manal, welcome to WNYC. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Lena, tell us about your work with Search for Common Ground.
Yeah, thanks a lot for inviting us, and it's a really important conversation that we're having. So Search for Common Ground really is an organization that believes that we can address conflict collaboratively and not adversarially. So we don't think that conflict is not natural. Conflict is part of our lives, and what we do in 30 countries across the world is enable people to have the tools, have the skills, and have the confidence to be able to transform that conflict without violence. Land conflicts, ethnic conflicts, resource conflicts, gender conflicts. We are enabling people across Africa and across the world to be able to work together, to recognize that in relationship, they're more secure and they're more safe moving towards peace than they would if they adopted violence.
Do you see the job as different in developing countries from the kind of Peace Department proposal Congressman Kucinich was describing for the United States, or other things in the context of this superpower?
I think there's certain challenges. I've worked, for example, the last 6 years in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has seen one of the century's worst wars. There's certainly issues where we need to raise people's awareness to ensure that they've got the same level of information so that they can engage equally as partners as they seek to transform a conflict. So sometimes we may need to have more of a component around education, maybe enabling people to reduce their stereotypes and their prejudices to be able to enter a space of trust and confidence to transform that conflict. But I would say that even in the United States, we also need to do those types of things as well, to depolarize and to reduce stereotypes and prejudices.
Manal, let me go to you next. Tell us about your work with the U.S. Institute of Peace.
Great, yeah, with the U.S. Institute of Peace, one of the primary issues, as my colleague was saying, is recognizing that conflict will always exist. The key is, how do you resolve conflict nonviolently? I think the most important aspect of our work is finding local partners on the ground. I always say that every culture, every country has the art of peace building. It has the art of conflict resolution. It's finding those natural stakeholders that are doing conflict resolution, working with them, adding a bit of the science, providing the tools, and providing safe space for them to be able to convene and address the issues of conflict.
Can you give me an example, Manal? Give us a success story from any country that you've worked in.
Sure. I'll give an example from one of the projects that we were working on in Iraq. One of the things that became very clear in Iraq, in an area, Kirkuk, which is still a very hot spot inside the country, was that the community didn't trust the police. And the police at the same time looked at the community, particularly the activists, as people who were, looking to instigate problems rather than to help provide security, which is what the police saw their primary objective as. One of the things that emerged was that there were clear people in the community who wanted to have that dialogue just between the police and between the civil society activists. So we helped support them, provided them with some tools to be able to convene both the police and the civil society activists first separately, so that there was an understanding of each other's role, and then bringing them together to say what the expectation from each group was, what the police expect from the community activists and what the community activists in return expected from the police. After a year of discussions and recommendations and dialogue, it was really clear that they were after the same goals, whereas where they started was from a point assuming that they each wanted to hinder or were obstacles to their work rather than being able to support their work. More recently in Libya, with the formation of the National Transitional Council and the revolutionaries, again, there was a strong disconnect between the revolutionaries, wanting to protect the spirit of the revolution and what they saw as a potential for it being sidetracked by a political process. And again, we saw just naturally within Libya people stepping forward who were activists in their own right, university professors who saw both sides and wanted to be able to convene both the youth, the revolutionaries, as well as the decision makers.
Lena, I wonder
and we help support that.
If from your experience with Search for Common Ground, you have a similar story, because it seems to me there are a lot of lessons in Manal's example there.
Yeah, and I think we have some very similar examples, but let me add two other dimensions. One dimension that's really important in transforming conflict is also understanding that a perpetrator of violence today can be a protector and an advocate of peace tomorrow. And so when you believe that you can understand the reasons that push this person into abusing human rights, into committing injustice, and that one can work with them so that they can transform and become your partner in peace tomorrow, that's really important. And that's the kind of work that, for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we're doing with the army and the police, who are, notorious for committing human rights abuses. Secondly, northern Nigeria. You've probably been hearing that every Sunday, Nigerians are suffering with these attacks by Boko Haram, right, on churches. And there's a big conflict and tension between Christians and Muslims in Nigeria right now. Yet they're not at all-out war. Why? Because organizations like ours, with many local partners, with local media, are enabling Christians and Muslims to stay in relationships. They're enabling them to come together, to remind themselves that, it's up to all of us to find a solution to this. This is not the situation we want. We talk about it on radio. We produce radio and television programs, and we bring people together so that they can see that finally it's up to us to believe in peace and not violence as a way out of this conflict.
Can I ask you, Lena, do you believe, on the bottom line question, that humanity can ever abolish war?
I think humanity can realize that war is the most ineffective way of dealing with conflict and injustice and inequality. And that when we recognize, as the Congressman was saying earlier, that it's being more effective, it's reaching a higher stage of evolution and development and harmony and just human intelligence, that if we resolve conflict by understanding each other's differences, acting on commonalities, reaching a sense of understanding of our common humanity, that is more effective, and that's going to lead to the abolishing of war.
Manal, what about you? Do you think that humanity can ever abolish war?
I think that is definitely a possibility in terms of, agreeing with my colleague in terms of the ineffectiveness of war. I also think that the reality is, even when war happens, that there still needs to be immediate responses after the war in terms of conflict resolution and peace-building efforts, so that it's not the only solution and they're not mutually exclusive.
So let me return with the two of you to this list of prerequisites to abolishing war that our listeners have tended to come up with, since the majority of the hundreds who posted on our site have said we can't abolish war, that global disparities between rich and poor would have to be reduced first, that democracy would need to replace domestic military rule worldwide, women would have to have half the power because testosterone fights, war won't end until it isn't so profitable. Lena, do you think that those are a meaningful core of prerequisites to ending war, or any of them in particular?
I think all of those things are part of the challenges of living as a human being in a society that is not equal, where there is injustice, where there is not full participation of all diverse voices in all of our societies. And those are challenges that we need to face. We can see them as opportunities for enabling there to be more equality, more participation, more inclusion. And those I see as the conflicts that we need to address by speaking to each other, understanding each other, and finding these solutions. So I don't see those as the problem. I see those as an opportunity to not respond with violence.
Manal, on one of those, you worked for Women for Women International in Sudan and elsewhere. How did that inform your perspective on war and gender?
I think one of the things that became very clear, I mean, particularly from my time in Iraq working with Women for Women International in Afghanistan, and it was solidified through what I saw in Sudan, was that women bear the brunt of war no matter what the context. And, recognizing that is that, women even now with the Arab Spring are at the forefront of the revolutions, and yet when it comes time to the decision making, they're completely absent and they're marginalized. And, a key element, I think, which was already mentioned, is how do you make sure that women are at the table. UN Resolution 1325 and others are, very important recommendations to take into consideration to ensure that women are there not only during the time of war paying the price, but at the time of peace building, because that's the only way that peace building, in my opinion, will be sustainable, is with women present.
Listeners, we will be adding your phone calls for the last 20 minutes of our End of War finale. After a break that's coming up soon, you can start calling in right now if you want to say something or talk to Congressman Kucinich or John Horgan, author of The End of War, Lena or Manal or any of the other guests we have here in the green space. 212-433-WNYC. Remember, though, please be specific on how humanity can abolish war, because that is the specific question on the table today for this End of War series finale. 212-433-9692. We'll also be speaking on the phone with a few people who've posted comments by the Guardian US website, which partnered with us in this project. Congressman Kucinich, do you want to react to what Manal and Lena were saying?
Well, first of all, I want to thank them for their commitment, but I do want to add a word of caution here. When we look at Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, which was also a war of choice by international powers, and then after you wreak havoc on these countries, you then go in and say, kumbaya, let's all get together. Let's work at conflict resolution. There's magical thinking there. If we create the wars, then we are not really accepting the consequences of what it is that we've done. And to go in and leave it to peacekeepers or to conflict resolution experts to try to heal that is way disconnected from what's really going on here. We have a country that has not been able to shed this imperialist instinct. And the idea that somehow we're going to dominate the world through surfing a global war on terror is insanity. And all the peace-building efforts in the world will fall apart in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in Libya and other places, as long as we keep thinking that we can use force to try to direct policies or the distribution of resources anywhere in the world.
So to what degree do you think the future potential of humanity abolishing war runs through the United States because it's the sole superpower?
Well, that's a question about the nature of power. There's power for everyone or for none. The idea that somehow we're the sole superpower, we got to reject that too. Every nation, every individual has power. And we cannot appropriate to ourselves some kind of a black hole of power that everything else gets sucked into and say everyone else is powerless. Look, no one would argue that the horrible tragedy when those planes went into the towers in this city weren't individuals expressing their sense of power. We have to be very careful about a nation which assumes that we're powerful and no one else is. And so what do you do? It's how you validate people's ability to be able to speak out on behalf of their group. And if they're trying to kill other people, that has to be challenged. I would never license violence of one group against another. But when we're talking about peace building, we have to be very careful about, on one hand, carrying the arrows and throwing them, and on the other hand, we have a healing hand. No, you can't have it both ways. You can't keep creating wars and on the other hand say, oh, we're going to stop them, because every time we drop a bomb, that not only expands the war, but it has a way of rippling far into the future and comes back at us, as Chalmers Johnson and others have written.
We will continue live from the green space, the finale of our series, End of War. Brian Lehrer and WNYC. Stay with us.
I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside. Oh, down by the riverside. Yeah, down by the riverside. I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside. I'm gonna study one word of
It's a special edition of the Brian Lehrer Show in the green space, the finale of our series, End of War. Listeners, you can watch today's program as well as hear it. See the live streaming video on our webpage at WNYC.org. Click on Brian Lehrer Show. Still with us, John Horgan, author of The End of War, Congressman Dennis Kucinich, Manal Omar from the U.S. Institute of Peace, Lena Slachmuijlder from Search for Common Ground, and others. And as we head toward the end of the program, I just want to open the floor for anyone in our green space audience and anyone on the phones. If any of the veterans of war or refugees of war here in the green space who we heard from earlier want to react now to anything that we've been talking about, we'll give you first priority. Any other audience members, just raise your hands. And listeners, 212-433-WNYC. I do want to go to somebody who's been holding for a long time, who contributed to this series online as a commenter, an Irish immigrant to the United States, Alistair Mullarney, living in San Diego now, who found this on the Guardian US website, which has reposted a lot of our End of War material. We thank them for that. Alistair, hello, welcome to WNYC. Hello from New York. And what led you to answer our question, can humanity abolish war?
Well, I'm a pessimist, as you can see from my submission. I believe that war has become far too profitable and too lucrative. I don't think it's, I mean, I would love to agree with Congressman's wanting to scale from personal domestic issues to world peace, but I think they are not comparable. In a domestic issue, everybody involved suffers. But in the wars that the U.S., for instance, wages, who suffers? Did Wolfowitz, Pearl, Rumsfeld, Powell, any of them suffer? No. They got very rich. At least Cheney's company got very rich off the war. I'm afraid I see no hope as long as we're brainwashed into revering the military to a state where even a reduction in the rate of increase in military spending is seen as an unpatriotic cut.
Thank you very much for chiming in. John Horgan, how about that piece in his response about revering the military? Somebody said to me along the way in this series, you know, it's not cool to be anti-troop these days, but I'm anti-troop.
Yeah, I think we have to figure out, so we just celebrated Memorial Day. And I was thinking about this issue of how, if we're trying to envision a world without peace and the eradication of war and even the reduction of militarism as good things, then how do we talk about people who are in the military now who have served? My father and grandfather were both Navy men who both fought in World War II, so this is a personal issue for me. I'm actually not sure how to answer that question, except that I'm encouraged by the fact that so many veterans, including ones that have spoken here today, recognize from firsthand experience the horrors of war and the irrationality of war, the waste of wars, even when those wars are considered to be relatively righteous. So it is a rhetorical problem, but I would think that the soldiers themselves can help us find a way out of that by getting behind the idea of a world without war.
All right, another caller now who saw our End of War project on the Guardian US website. Michelle Balaev teaches English at Wake Forest University in North Carolina and is founder of a group called Professors for Peace. Professor Balaev, hello. Do you think humanity can ever abolish war?
Yes, I do. I do think it's possible. And I think it really starts with the people. The people have to pressure their government. And in order for that to happen, they need to know the truth. And unfortunately, we often don't hear the truth or see the truth from the media. But I don't blame the media, because I think it comes back to people. We are often afraid to see the truth of war, because the truth of war is that it's a horrifying, ugly mess. And we want to sleep well at night. We want to have good dreams. So we don't want to know the truth of war. So we're apathetic and we're complacent, and the media becomes complacent, and the government is complacent. So it's just a vicious cycle.
In your opinion, what could break through that cycle?
Well, I think people have to have some courage and face the truth. And realize that war is really a euphemism for murder, and I don't think anyone supports murder just because you can. So we need to take local action and put a local pressure on our governments.
Thank you very much. Could I ask Saad over there, who came to the U.S. after the Bosnian War, what are you thinking in this recent part of the conversation?
Well, I think that I mentioned before, more and more people actually are aware of all those horrible things that happen in the war. And I think that we just have to continue to build based on this momentum. And I think Congressman's approach is good, but it will take a long time to implement all this. And I mentioned also before that I think that diplomacy and miscommunication that happened before Bosnian War was one of the reasons why that war lasted for 4 years. So more communication, and I think that we can achieve this.
Carl Callender from Black Veterans for Social Justice, what are you thinking?
I took issue when the gentleman mentioned that we shouldn't have the reverence for the troops. These are the same troops that stand ready to protect the nation at any point in time. During times of peace, the troops aren't in a hostile stance. We're in a more or less a self-defensive posture. And I think we ought to be revered, and the troops are serving are still to be revered based on the fact that they sacrifice their time, their lives, and sometimes their relationships with their family. They also come back with significant psychological casualties that they have to live with for the duration of the rest of their lives. PTSD, depression. For some of the female troops, they suffer from military sexual trauma, and they're revered because of that sacrifice and that they served. So that's what I was thinking at this point in juncture of the telegram.
Thank you very much. Tariq from Iraq, can we get a microphone over here and see what you've been thinking as you hear different people who've worked around the world talk about their peace-building efforts, Lena and Manal, and some of the other conversations. We can't even agree on how to bring peace. That makes it harder to bring peace. But what have you been thinking, so recently arrived from Iraq?
Yeah, I'm thinking that as long as there's different kind of divisions of religions and political and rich people, there is always going to be war. This is from my opinion.
Let's go to another of our callers who saw our End of War project on the Guardian U.S. website. Peter Stephenson is a U.S. citizen living in Kunming, China, where he and his wife teach English. They did that previously in Vietnam. Peter, hello from New York. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
What led
Can you hear me?
I sure can. And what led you to answer our question, can humanity abolish war?
Well, it's a question I've given a lot of thought to, and I've done a lot of reading in the past few years. So that's what drew my attention to it. I actually, what sort of started my process of learning about these kinds of issues was I happened to pick up a copy of Alexander Berkman's book, What is Anarchism? From a great little bookstore and cafe in Baltimore called Red Emma's, named after Emma Goldman. And, I guess, first of all, the idea, there's been a lot of talk about, people need to learn how to get along better, and we need conflict resolution, and our culture needs to become less violent. But I think in some ways that's kind of a straw man argument, because it's not people who start wars. People don't start wars. We know, the average person knows how to get along and resolve conflicts without murdering each other. It's politicians that start wars, period. This is something, and the way that politicians get average citizens who know how to live peacefully to join them in these wars is by telling a huge lie, basically.
Peter, let me follow up with you on one thing.
Ahead,
Peter,
sorry.
can you hear me? When you were living in Vietnam, given their experience with millions dead in the 60s and 70s, did the people you knew there ever talk about how humanity could abolish war? Was this on their lips?
Not really. I mean, I didn't, I wasn't in a position to have that kind of a conversation. That they were more concerned with reviving their economy, and just trying to, because Vietnam's still a very poor country,
yes,
and also trying to deal with the long-lasting effects of having more bombs dropped on them than in all of World War II.
Indeed. Thank you very much for participating in this with us. We really appreciate it. Let's go back to our Green Space audience. There's a comment over here. You've got it right there.
Yes, my name is Ian, and my question is, with two pro-war candidates on top of the tickets of the two major parties this fall, how can we get a message of peace, this conversation we're having today, in the political arena, and also get people to realize the economics of this discussion as well? And I want to mention that I'm very proud to be wearing my Kucinich for President t-shirt.
Well, then you can answer that question, Congressman.
It's going to be those of us who want to participate at some level in that election in 2012 to challenge the candidates who represent both political parties to define what they'll do to take America in a different direction with respect to matters of war and peace. I want to mention something that is so obvious, but it should be mentioned. The UN Charter, the UN in its formative moment, was formed to end the scourge of war for all time. And if we've learned anything in the time since the UN has been formed, is really the insufficiency of the nation state to be able to deal directly with matters of conflict, the limitations of the nation state. And what I think is happening, that takes us way past 2012 election, is that there is an emerging awareness of a kind of a global citizenship that is above the nation state, that all over the world people are saying, stop it, just stop it. And it's starting to impact governments. And when we get enough of that in the United States, it'll impact our government.
Can I very quickly address that? Here's how optimistic I am. I actually think there is enormous potential for a courageous, imaginative political candidate to create a coalition for a national peace movement, that being a central part of a platform for the presidency. It would consist of traditional peace activists, secular believers in peace, plus people who take the commandment, thou shalt not kill, seriously. So I think there's enormous potential among religious conservatives. I think there's great potential in the Tea Party types, people who are obsessed with government spending. Look at the enormous waste of the defense budget. It's the most obvious place where we need to cut our national budget. Feminists, veterans. I think, again, you have somebody with the eloquence of Dennis really could make this happen if they just recognize the potential. So now the idea is out there. I hope somebody takes advantage of it.
Well, I think we're going to end here. The complexity is clear. We have bitten off no small task to talk about how to abolish war. This ends our End of War series. It obviously does not end the conversation among people in the Brian Lehrer Show community, and hopefully it is just one drop in the ocean that continues to ripple out so that people don't assume that war is simply a given and actually have these conversations